All right, diving in today. And we've got a concept that's really going to resonate with you, especially for anyone with, a philosopher's mindset. We're talking sortals.
Total.
And, you might be thinking, okay, another philosophical term, but trust me, this one's a real gem.
Yeah.
It gets right to the heart of how we categorize the world, how we move from just like a sea of stuff
Yeah.
to distinct things.
Right.
We're not just playing with words here. This goes deep into like metaphysics, philosophy of language, how our minds work, even touches on logic itself. And thankfully, you've given us a ton to work with. That Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Sortals, that's gold.
Yeah.
So our mission, if you will, is to unpack all of this, get to the core of Sortals, see how the concept developed, and, of course, dive into those juicy debates that philosophers just love to get stuck into. But
Yeah.
before we get all tangled up in the details, I got to ask, for someone who, really appreciates the structure of thought like you do, where does the study of sortals even begin?
If we're talking about the foundations of how we understand the world, it all starts with this really basic intuition. The world, right, it comes at us as this mix of like continuous stuff and then these separate, distinct things.
Hmm.
And what's really fascinating, at least to me, is how we tend to latch onto the things, onto objects. Why? Because they've got properties that stick around, properties that are useful, even when the stuff they're made of changes.
Like that classic thought experiment, Theseus's ship.
Exactly. That ship getting like plank by plank replaced. Is it still the same ship?
Right, right. And that's where this idea of sortals comes in.
It does. That puzzle, it throws us right into the heart of what sortals are all about.
So for someone like you, confidently grappling with the very essence of identity,
Mhm.
that thought experiment just opens up a whole can of worms, doesn't it? What even makes a thing a thing? How do
Mhm.
we count them if they're always changing? What makes this one sculpture different from that one, even if they're made from the same, I don't know, bronze?
Absolutely. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that sortals try to untangle. And here's where things get even more interesting, especially from a philosophical perspective. There's this like fault line running through it all. Oh. On one side, you've got the realists, right? They're saying objects are just, part of the objective reality. They exist regardless of us. Then on the other side, you've got the conceptualists and nominalists. They're saying, hold on, it's our minds, our languages that create the objects we see.
So we're imposing order on the chaos.
Kind of, yeah. And what's cool about sortals is that it gives us a way to look at this whole debate. It helps us understand how we go from like this undifferentiated mass of stuff to these separate, countable, lasting things. And it does that whether you're a realist or, leaning more towards the conceptualist side.
So it's like a framework almost, a way to think about individuation and identity.
Precisely. A set of principles, maybe even constraints on how we can even make sense of objects in a world that's, always in flux.
Right, right. And this whole idea of sortals, this isn't exactly a new thing, is it? Like the term itself has its own little history, right?
Oh, absolutely. For you, I mean, someone who loves tracing the development of ideas, it's fascinating stuff. So that Stanford Encyclopedia entry gives the credit to John Locke back in 1690. He's the one who coined the term sortal.
Okay.
But here's a bit of irony. For someone who appreciates the twists and turns of intellectual history,
Yeah.
Locke, his main focus was on this thing he called the essence of a thing.
Essence.
Yeah. He said the essence of a genus or sort, it's just the abstract idea that a general name, a sortal name, stands for. So for Locke, sortal was all about this idea of a nominal essence, a definition.
Okay.
But, and here's the kicker, a big part of his whole project in his essay concerning human understanding was to take down Aristotelian essentialism. That idea that things have these built-in mind-independent essences.
So he's introducing the term while kind of arguing against one way of understanding it. That's wild.
It is, isn't it? I mean, talk about complicating things.
It's like a built-in philosophical debate right from the start.
Exactly.
So who else was working on these ideas, even if they weren't using the term sortal?
Well, if we're thinking about, the connections between thinkers, we can look at Spinoza. He was writing around the same time as Locke.
Right.
And while he didn't use the word sortal, he was super focused on the idea of counting. And he made this really interesting observation. He said, to count different things together, like, say, a penny and a dollar,
Yeah.
you need some kind of shared label, something that acts like a sortal. In this case, it'd be something like piece of money or coin. Without that, counting them as two doesn't really make sense.
So it's not just about counting individual things, it's about understanding them as belonging to a kind, a category that lets you group them together.
Exactly. And then we come to Frege, late 19th century. He didn't use the word sortal either, but he made a huge contribution. Frege was all about knowing what kind of thing you're counting.
So not just how many, but how many what?
Exactly. And he's also the one who brought us the phrase criterion of identity.
And that's crucial, right? Like having a standard, a set of rules to figure out if two things are actually the same thing.
Absolutely. Now, for those who, like to delve into the scholarly debates,
Well, you know me.
there's some discussion about exactly how Frege meant that criterion. Did he mean it applied to all types of identity or just to numbers? But generally, most people think he meant the broader application.
So he was laying the groundwork for a more rigorous idea of identity beyond just naming and counting.
He was. And then, fast forward to the mid-20th century, and we have Peter Strawson.
Strawson.
He's the one who brought sortal back into the spotlight, really made it a key term. His book, Individuals, published in 1959, it really solidified the way we understand sortals today. It's interesting, though, he didn't explicitly connect his use of the term back to Locke or those earlier thinkers.
So he was kind of doing his own thing, building on those ideas, but maybe in a new way.
In a way, yeah. He was really focused on what he called sortal universals, and he saw them as the foundation for how we distinguish things, how we count them, how we figure out if they're the same or different.
Okay.
He even laid it out, very clearly. He said, to know if there are two G's in a region S, you have to know there's an X that's a G in S, and a Y that's a G in S but not the same as X, and that anything else that's a G in S has to be either X or Y. Like, he really spelled it out.
So he's connecting sortals, counting, and identity really tightly.
Exactly. And it's at this point that the Stanford Encyclopedia entry brings up this distinction between counting and measuring and how that plays out in language. They talk about the mass count distinction, which is a linguistic thing.
Right, like we say two dogs, but we wouldn't say two waters, at least not usually.
Yeah, exactly. So linguists, they talk about count nouns like dog, which you use with how many, and they have plurals, right?
Yeah.
And then there are mass nouns like water, which go with how much and usually don't have plurals. And philosophers, they often connect count nouns to sortals.
So dog would be a sortal, but water wouldn't.
That's the general idea. We count dogs, we measure water. But of course, it's not always that simple.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if you go to a restaurant and ask for two waters, everyone knows what you mean. You mean two glasses or bottles of water, and those you can count.
Exactly. And the Stanford entry acknowledges that. It's not always black and white. Water on its own isn't a sortal, but when we have a specific unit in mind, like bottle or glass, then it becomes countable. It's almost like, depending on the context, a mass noun can act sortal-like.
And isn't there something about differences between languages, too?
Oh, yeah. For anyone interested in linguistics, this is fascinating. Like, in English, we count vegetables, right? But in German, the word for vegetables, Gemüse, it's treated as a mass noun. You use it with how much, even though it's basically the same stuff.
So it's like language can influence how we see the world, how we categorize things.
It can. It might not be a perfect reflection of the philosophical distinctions, but it definitely plays a role.
So what about those nouns that grammatically seem like count nouns, but maybe aren't really sortals in the philosophical sense, like red thing or object?
Ah, yes. This is a crucial distinction. So grammatically, yeah, we can say red things and objects and ask how many, but for most philosophers, those aren't genuine sortals. The problem is you can't really give a clear rule for counting them.
Mm.
Like, take red thing. If you have one red object, you could argue there are infinitely many red things within it, the top half, the bottom half, the left side, and so on.
Oh, I see, yeah.
There's no definite answer to how many red things in the same way there is for how many dogs.
So it's too vague, too open to interpretation.
Exactly. An object is even worse. It's just way too broad to have any meaningful criteria for counting or identity.
Got it. A real sortal needs to be specific enough that you can actually use it to individuate, to count things in a way that makes sense. And speaking of identity, that's something that comes up a lot in discussions of sortals.
It does.
The entry says that a key part of being a sortal is that it provides a criterion of identity. Now, for someone who likes analyzing definitions, what does that even mean? And what are the big disagreements about it?
So, at its core, the idea is this. A sortal gives you a way to determine if two things are actually the same thing, like numerically identical, not just similar. And this criterion of identity, it's basically a set of conditions, like necessary and sufficient conditions. But the thing is, how strict are those conditions? That's where the debate starts.
Okay.
Strawson, he started out with a really strict definition. He said you should be able to explain the criterion without even using the concept of identity, or by only using it on the parts of the objects.
So like a super precise, almost mathematical definition of sameness.
Kind of, yeah. But then he kind of backed off a bit. He realized it was hard to maintain that level of precision for everything we deal with in the real world.
So it works in theory, but not always in practice.
Pretty much. Wiggins, on the other hand, he stuck with a stricter view on what counts as a good criterion for counting.
And this ties into those classic principles, right? The indiscernibility of identicals and the identity of indiscernibles.
Absolutely. Those are closely related ideas. The first one says if two things are identical, they have to have all the same properties. The second one, the one that's more controversial, says if two things have all the same properties, they must be identical. When we talk about Sortals providing a criterion of identity, it often means that if you have two things that are both of a certain sortal, like if they're both F and they share a bunch of properties relevant to being F, then they're the same F.
Right.
But then you have someone like Geach, and he throws a real curveball into all of this. He talks about the strong sortal relativity of identity, and that's a big challenge to how we normally think about identity.
Relativity of identity. That sounds complicated.
It is, but also really interesting, especially for someone who loves a good philosophical puzzle.
Hit me with it.
So Geach says identity isn't like this absolute thing. He says it's always relative to a sortal, so something could be the same F as something else, but not the same G.
Okay, I'm going to need an example here.
Sure, sure. He uses this example of like bronze that's made into a statue, and then that statue is melted down and made into a different statue. He'd say those two statues aren't the same statue, but they are the same bronze.
So the identity of the stuff is constant, but the identity of the thing is relative to how you're categorizing it.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And it really messes with our intuition that identity is just this straightforward universal thing.
So how did other philosophers respond to that? It sounds like a pretty radical claim.
Oh, they definitely had some thoughts. Quine, for example, he was a big critic of Geach's view. He defended the traditional view that identity is just one thing, not relative to anything. His way of dealing with those tricky examples was to say that one of the statements, like the one about the bronze being the same statue, isn't actually a true identity statement. He would often distinguish between what a thing is made of and the thing itself. So the bronze might make up both statues, but it's not actually identical to either of them.
Ah, so it's about the constitution versus the actual, like, numerical identity of the thing.
Exactly.
And didn't the example of the Holy Trinity come up somewhere in all of this?
It did. The Trinity, with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being distinct persons but one God, it looks like it might be a case where you have different things under one sortal person, but the same thing under another God. But, as the entry points out, the Trinity is a whole other can of worms, theologically and philosophically.
Definitely a deep dive for another day. So we've got this strong sortal relativity of identity, which seems pretty wild.
Yeah.
But what about the weaker version?
Right. The weaker claim is a bit more moderate. It says that, yeah, identity itself is still an absolute thing, but the way we figure out if things are identical, the criteria we use, those can be different depending on what kind of thing we're talking about. So the way we figure out if two sets are the same by looking at if they have the same members, that's different from how we figure out if two numbers are the same, or if the car I own today is the same car I owned 5 years ago, even if it's had some work done on it. For things like people or artifacts, we might look at the continuity of their life or function.
So it's not that identity itself is relative, it's that the way we determine it can vary.
Exactly. It's like there's this general concept of identity, but the specific criteria we use, those are just ways of applying that general concept in different areas.
Got it. So moving on, the Stanford entry then delves into Wiggins's focus on substance sortals. How do those differ from other types of sortals?
Well, Wiggins, he makes a distinction between substance sortals, phase sortals, and restricted sortals.
Okay, a lot of sortals going on here.
Right. So phase sortals, like kitten, they only apply during a certain stage of something's existence. A kitten grows up to be a cat, but it's still the same individual. Restricted sortals, like brown dog, they can stop being true without the thing itself changing. A brown dog could get its fur dyed, or just go gray naturally.
Makes sense.
Wiggins argues that substance sortals are the most important because they tell us what a thing really is and what it needs to keep being that thing.
So it's about what makes a thing persist through time and change.
Exactly. And within substance sortals, he also has this idea of ultimate sortals.
Ultimate sortals.
Yeah. These are sortals that either don't restrict any others or they give you a clear idea of how a thing persists without needing to refer to other sortals. He's trying to find the most basic level of categorization, the one that grounds everything else.
Okay. I'm following.
The thing is, though, Wiggins doesn't give a lot of concrete examples of ultimate sortals.
So it's kind of a theoretical idea without a lot of real-world application?
Sort of. He suggests man might be the ultimate sortal for Julius Caesar, but that's about it.
That's not very helpful.
No, it's not. And without more examples, it's hard to really grasp what he means.
So it's like a good idea in principle, but tricky to actually use.
Yeah, and it also raises questions about, how well this whole biological model of substance sortals works for things that aren't living, like artifacts. Those often seem to persist because of their function, not their biological continuity. And even with living things, his examples, like elm and frog, those aren't strict species terms, so it gets a bit fuzzy.
Sounds like trying to define these fundamental categories is a pretty tough job.
It is, and that brings us back to the definition of sortal itself.
Okay.
We've said that sortals let you count things, right? But they've also been described as giving us essences, answering the question, what is it? Telling us how things persist, and allowing us to pick out individuals.
So it's a busy little concept doing a lot of work.
It is, and those different descriptions, they don't always line up perfectly.
Oh, of course.
Like something might be countable but not have a clear essence, at least not one that everyone agrees on. And that whole idea of essence, that's a huge debate in itself.
A whole other deep dive. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Sortal essentialism tries to bridge the gap by saying that belonging to a particular sortal is what gives something its essence.
And didn't Wiggins himself complicate things further by giving examples of terms that let you pick out individuals, but that don't have clear counting criteria?
He did, like crown, wave, or garden.
Yeah.
We can talk about the Pope's crown, but how many crowns is that really?
So it's possible to individuate something without being able to count instances of it.
It seems that way, yeah. It's not as straightforward as one might think.
So we've talked about Locke, Spinoza, Frege, Strawson, Wiggins, and now the entry brings up Quine and his talk of individuative terms.
Right. Quine, he used terms like term that divides its reference or individuative word. And early on, he kind of suggested they were the same as Strawson's sortals.
Okay.
But if you look closely, it's not really the same.
How so?
Quine thought object itself was a term that divides its reference, even though it doesn't fit Strawson or Wiggins' definition of a sortal. It's too broad, remember?
Right. It doesn't give you a way to count specifically.
Exactly. So Quine, he was more focused on how a term picks out things in the world, not necessarily on providing those strict criteria for counting an identity that Strawson and Wiggins were all about.
So it's a slightly different emphasis, a different way of approaching the problem.
Yeah. And Quine, he was also a pragmatist, He was more interested in the language itself, not so much in uncovering some deep metaphysical truth. He contrasted these individuative terms with mass terms, like water, which he said have this cumulative reference. Meaning any bunch of stuff that's water, it's still water.
Okay.
And there are examples in the entry that show how this distinction can be a bit arbitrary, kind of dependent on the language you're using.
So different philosophers, different tools, different goals. Makes sense.
It does. And up to this point, we've been talking mostly about physical objects. But what about abstract things like ideas or governments? Do sortals work for those?
Ooh, that's a good question. Like, can you count ideas?
Well, in a way we do. We talk about how many ideas a politician has or how many times a government has changed. But when it comes to figuring out their identity, it gets really tricky.
Yeah, like, when did Rice Institute become Rice University? Was it a change to the same institution, or did one end and another begin?
Exactly. Those questions about persistence and identity, they get really fuzzy when we're talking about abstract things. The Stanford entry also brings up collections, like a flock of birds. How do you define the identity of a flock when the birds themselves are constantly changing? And even in math, where things seem really precise, there are debates about the identity of different types of numbers.
So whether it's concrete or abstract, identity is just slippery.
It is, and this leads us to another interesting area. how sortals relate to cognition. Psychologists have actually started studying this, from an empirical perspective.
Oh, interesting. Like, how does our brain handle all this categorization?
Exactly. And one of the big questions is whether physical object itself is a sortal, cognitively speaking. Which is interesting because philosophically we've said it's probably not a true sortal.
So are psychologists finding different answers?
Some are. Who, for example, argues that physical object is like a starting point sortal for babies.
So even before language, babies have a sense of what a physical object is.
That's what her research suggests, yeah. She says babies have these basic expectations about physical objects, like how to count them and how they persist through time.
That's amazing. But not everyone agrees.
Right. Ayers, he says physical object is important, for sure, but it's not a sortal in the strict sense
No, no.
because it's not specific enough about what makes something a physical object. He says it's not just any continuous region of space-time, it's a maximal one.
Hmm.
So you can see how the psychology mirrors some of the philosophical debates. Some focus on our ability to pick out and track things, while others want a more specific definition of what makes a thing a kind of thing.
And what about language? Does that play a role in all this?
Quine, he thought language was crucial. He said we only really start seeing the world as made up of objects when we learn language and concepts like identity and counting. But there's research that suggests that even before language, babies and even some primates can do some basic object individuation.
So maybe it's both. Like, we have some innate ability to see objects, but language refines it.
Could be.
The Stanford entry also mentions these basic level objects. What are those and how do they connect to sortals?
So this idea comes from Rush. She found that we have a preferred level of categorization, like we'll say dog, rather than mammal or poodle.
So it's the most natural, most informative level.
Exactly. And these basic level categories, they're rich in information about what things look like and what they do. Now, they don't necessarily have that traditional essence that some philosophers want for sortals, but they're still important.
In what way?
Well, some think that this is how we learn sortal words.
Ah, so our brains are already primed to see the world in terms of these basic level categories, and that makes it easier to learn words for them.
Exactly. And there might even be rules for word learning that work especially well at this basic level, like this mutual exclusivity constraint, the idea that different words should refer to different things.
Okay, so our brains and our language are working together here.
They are. And finally, there's the connection between sortals and logic.
Right, right.
So logicians have also noticed these differences between types of things, and they've tried to build that into formal logic.
Like how?
Well, there are these things called many-sorted logics, where different variables are used for different kinds of things.
Okay.
So you might have one variable for people and another for numbers. It's a way of representing those ontological differences within the logical system itself.
So it's more precise, more nuanced.
It is. And then there are also logics that are specifically designed to deal with sortals, logics of sortals. These try to capture the unique features of sortal terms, like how the negation of a sortal usually isn't a sortal itself. Stevenson, he developed an early theory of sortals that fit in with some of Wiggins' ideas about identity. Cocchiarella, he had a more conceptualist approach, including things like tense and modal operators. And this work on sortals and logic, it's even found applications in artificial intelligence.
Really? So this isn't just an abstract philosophical concept. It has real-world implications.
Absolutely. In areas like knowledge representation, the idea of sortals is being used to define the basic categories within a system. And they often draw on the work of philosophers like Wiggins and Strawson.
So it's like those philosophers were laying the groundwork for how we might build intelligent systems.
In a way, yeah. And a big part of that is having clear criteria for identity and being able to tell the difference between rigid categories like substance sortals and non-rigid ones like phase sortals.
Wow. So this seemingly abstract philosophical concept is making its way into AI.
It is, and it all comes back to the importance of understanding how we categorize things in the world.
Right.
As the Stanford entry concludes, the fact that so many big-name philosophers have spent so much time thinking about sortals tells us that there's something really important there.
Something fundamental about how we understand the world.
Exactly. And even though we might not have one single definition everyone agrees on, all those different approaches, all those shared concerns, they show just how complex this whole stuff and things business really is.
So stepping back a bit, what does all of this tell us? It seems like the study of sortals takes us right to the core of some pretty big questions. Questions about reality, language, how our minds work, even AI.
It does. It's a concept with a long history, and it's still relevant today across all these different areas.
So, for our listener out there, the one who loves a good philosophical challenge, what's the takeaway? Well, we've seen that sortal is a multifaceted term with a long and winding history. The debates about what it means and what it implies, those are still going strong, and they're shaping how we think about identity, counting, essence, cognition, and logic.
Absolutely. It just goes to show even simple questions like, what is this and how many are there, can lead to some seriously deep philosophical thinking.
So, for you, our philosophically minded listener, here's a final thought. Given all these different interpretations and applications of sortal, what do you think is its most important role in philosophy? Does the fact that we don't have one agreed upon definition make it more useful or less useful?
It really makes you think about the nature of philosophical concepts, doesn't it? And how they help us understand the world and ourselves.
It does. And if you're interested in exploring this further, we encourage you to dig into the works of the philosophers we've mentioned, or maybe look at how sortals are being used in areas like cognitive science or AI.
There's a lot to discover there.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.